In this video, we explore horror stories told by our grandparents, tales that have survived the test of time, bringing warnings and hiding secrets that refuse to be forgotten.
The Call of the Shadows.
We never knew exactly what my grandmother saw in that forest, but she said she would never set foot in those trees again. My grandmother used to tell us a story that always left me chilled. She said that when she was a child, she got lost in a forest near her family's house. Although everyone in the village knew those trees, no one had ever wanted to venture too deep. That afternoon, while playing alone, she ignored the warnings and followed a path she didn't recognize. It was the worst thing she could have done. The evening was already dark when my grandmother realized she didn't know how to get back. The shadows among the trees grew, and despite her efforts to follow what she thought was the right path, everything looked the same. She ran for a while, but exhaustion and desperation forced her to stop. That's when she saw a faint light in the distance, between the trunks. A small cabin. She was sure someone there could help her. As she got closer, she noticed the cabin looked very old, with discolored wood and windows covered by tattered curtains. There was no sound around her, not even the wind. When she knocked on the door, it opened with a long creak, revealing an empty room. Inside, everything was covered in dust, as if it hadn't been lived in for years. But the fireplace, oddly, was lit, and a wooden chair was placed right in front of the fire. My grandmother, exhausted and scared, thought of going in to take shelter until someone appeared. But just as she crossed the door, something changed. The air became dense and she heard steps, slow, heavy, coming down the stairs at the back of the cabin. At first, she thought it might be an old man, maybe the owner of the house, but as the steps got closer, a strange feeling overcame her. It didn't sound human. Something was coming down. What appeared wasn't an old man, not at all. It was a tall, thin figure, with skin stretched over its bones as if barely covering them. Its arms were long and moved unnaturally, as if it had no full control over them. Where its eyes should have been, there were two dark cavities, and its mouth, twisted grotesquely, revealed sharp, needle-like teeth. My grandmother couldn't move, paralyzed by fear, as the figure descended and got closer and closer to her. She could see up close that its skin, grayish and cracked, had a wet sheen, as if it had just emerged from something far worse than the forest. The strange being moved with slow but firm steps, advancing toward her, stopping just a few steps away. My grandmother always said that at that moment, she felt as if she wasn't alone in her own body, as if something else had invaded her. She tried to scream, but not a single sound came out of her throat. The creature's empty eyes seemed to look at her, even though there was nothing there to see her. However, she knew she was being watched, analyzed. Each second felt eternal as that thing came closer and closer. The being raised one of its long arms and extended its hand toward her. Its fingers were so long it seemed they could completely wrap around her. My grandmother felt the cold before it even touched her, a cold that was not of this world. At that moment, my grandmother was able to react. She turned around and ran without stopping. She didn't know how her legs could move so fast, but she didn't look back. The sound of the creature's footsteps echoed in her head, resonating in every corner of the forest as she ran between the trees, not caring where she was headed. The branches tangled in her hair, and the stones cut her bare feet, but nothing mattered. All she could think about was escaping. My grandmother didn't remember how she got out of the forest. She only knew that when she realized it, she was outside, on the edge of the path that led back to the village. She didn't stop until she reached home, panting, with the sensation that that thing was still behind her, hidden among the trees. My grandmother says she never went near that forest again, although she says that during the nights, when she sleeps, the figure from the cabin still appears to her, and she feels the shadows calling her in the silence of the night.
The Mark.
My grandfather didn't understand where the cold came from until he saw that ghostly figure standing in the middle of the hallway on the first floor. There was a story my grandfather only told me on stormy nights. He said he did it so that I would think twice before taking on work in places with an unknown history. Many years ago, when my grandfather was 20, he was hired to repair a house that had been abandoned after its owner's death. The rumors about the house said that the owner had been a hermit, someone who never let anyone into his home. He died alone, and on the day of his funeral, no one approached his coffin. My grandfather was one of the few who dared to enter that house, not out of bravery, but because he needed the money. The first day, everything was normal, except for the constant cold, a chill that wouldn't go away, even with the windows closed. He was fixing the windows on the second floor when suddenly he heard what he described as a faint murmur. He thought it was the wind, though there was no breeze. But the worst part came when, as he descended to the first floor, he saw the figure of a man standing in the hallway. He was tall, thin, and wore a dark suit, though his features were hard to make out in the dim light. My grandfather didn't know what to do. His first instinct was to approach, thinking someone else had entered the house. He took a few steps before the man slowly turned his head toward him. That's when my grandfather realized that what he was seeing wasn't a normal person. The man's eyes were sunken, like mere shadows on his face, and his skin had a grayish tone. The figure stared at him intently before vanishing into the darkness of the hallway. My grandfather tried to convince himself that what he saw was just an illusion, a product of exhaustion. But that night he couldn't sleep. The memory of those empty eyes lingered in his mind. The next day, while working in the kitchen, a loud bang came from the second floor, as if someone had dropped a heavy piece of furniture. My grandfather went upstairs, thinking that something might have fallen, but found nothing. Then, he saw something that froze him in place. On the door of the room that had previously been locked, there was now a mark. 3 long, deep scratches, as if something had tried to claw through the wood in a fit of rage. The door, which he swore he had locked, was slightly ajar. Unable to contain his curiosity and perhaps wanting to challenge the fear that gripped him, my grandfather pushed the door open and entered. The air inside the room was freezing, colder than the rest of the house. Everything was covered in dust, except for a chair in one corner, which seemed to have been recently dragged there. Around the chair, on the floor, he saw what appeared to be footprints, as if someone had been walking in circles in the dust that covered the floor. Suddenly, he felt a weight in the air, something heavy and dense. Before he could react, he heard a whisper behind him, so low that he could barely understand it. "You shouldn't have come." My grandfather spun around, and there in the dark corner of the room was the man again. This time his face was clearer, his eyes still empty, but now there was a dark gleam in them, a malice my grandfather hadn't sensed before. The figure began to move toward him, its steps slow but deliberate, and with each step, the floor creaked. When the figure was just a few steps away, it extended a long, bony hand toward his arm. At the touch, he felt a burning scratch, and it left a mark on his skin. A mark that my grandfather still had the day he told me the story. My grandfather doesn't know how he managed to break free from its grasp, but once he did, he ran until he reached the front door. He tried to open the door, but his hands were shaking so much, and he could feel the burn of the mark on his arm. After several attempts, he managed to open the door, and without a second thought, he ran out, leaving his tools behind. My grandfather never returned to that house, and the mark on his arm never faded. My grandfather says that from time to time he feels a chill run down his spine, and something tells him that man has followed him ever since he first saw him in that house. That after all these years, he's still there, watching from the darkness.
The shadow in the window.
During his youth, my grandfather was an adventurous man, until that thing in the cabin changed his view of the world. My grandfather was always a cheerful man, but there was one story he told with a serious face, as if reliving every moment. It happened when he was 20, in a small cabin he had built with his friend Jake in the mountains. The two of them had decided to spend the summer in that cabin, far from everything, where only wild animals ventured. Jake and my grandfather had known each other since they were kids and had always been inseparable, so staying in the woods seemed like a great idea. At first, everything was normal. The nights were cool, and darkness wrapped around the place like a thick blanket. It was the solitude they liked the most, the deep silence only broken by the chirping of a cricket or the distant howl of a wolf. However, one night while they were eating by the fire, something changed. My grandfather was the first to notice an unnatural silence. All the sounds of the forest had stopped, as if an invisible presence was watching them. Jake noticed it too, and without saying a word, they both felt a growing discomfort. They decided to go to bed early, but in the middle of the night, a sound woke them up. Soft knocks, as if someone or something was walking slowly around the cabin. My grandfather tried to convince Jake that it was just branches tapping against the roof, but deep down, he knew it wasn't. The next night, the knocks returned, this time much closer. They were clearly heard on the windows, like someone dragging their nails across the glass, scratching it. When Jake, trembling with fear, looked out the window, he saw a thin figure, too tall to be a normal human. It stood a few meters away, under the pale moonlight. It had no face, or at least none that could be distinguished. Its arms were long, disproportionate, and its skin was white, almost translucent. It was just standing there, motionless, as if studying them, without looking away. My grandfather barely managed to step back when the figure vanished in a blink. They spent hours in complete silence, unsure of what to do, staying awake until the first light of dawn calmed them a little. Despite what they had seen, they decided to stay. On the third night, the events worsened. The knocks on the windows started earlier and were much louder. This time, they were accompanied by a sensation of extreme cold, as if the temperature had suddenly dropped inside the cabin. The figure that had once been far away now seemed to have entered the house. My grandfather and Jake woke up at the same time, terrified, feeling a weight on their chests, as if something was sitting on them. Jake tried to get up, but his body wouldn't respond. My grandfather, fighting the panic, looked toward the bedroom door, which was slightly open, and then he saw it. That figure, clearer than ever, was standing in the doorway, watching them. It was even taller than he remembered, with limbs that touched the floor. It had no face, but somehow, it conveyed a sense of hunger, of a primal need. My grandfather tried to scream, but no sound came out. The thing started to move slowly toward Jake's bed, who remained paralyzed. As it advanced, its feet, thin and deformed, made no sound, as if it floated just above the floor. My grandfather could see how the entity stretched its long fingers into the air, about to touch Jake's face, which was frozen with fear, tears streaming down his cheeks. With great effort, my grandfather managed to let out a scream so loud that it made Jake react. And just at that moment, the figure vanished. They couldn't sleep again, sitting in the living room for the rest of the night. At dawn, they gathered the few things they had and left without speaking a word about what had happened. Both felt that, although the figure disappeared that night, its presence followed them. My grandfather says he never went back to the mountains, but sometimes, in the darkness of his room in the middle of the night, he felt that thing watching him from some corner of the house, as if it had stayed with him since that night in the cabin. Thank you for journeying with us through the dark passages of these stories. If you enjoyed them, give us a like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss more tales of terror. Until next time, where fear will once again be your companion.